Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nadya Wang, and I'm the editor at Art and Market. I will be the moderator for tonight's panel discussion about the future of the collective experience. Tonight's event is part of CIFA 2020, imagined as CIFA version 2.0, which provides a space for artists to share their views on creating art and how it might change going forward in the new normal. It has to date featured a series of virtual events, including talks, panels, vodkas, and workshops, as well as films made available through video on demand and select screenings at Oldham Theatre. And tonight, we would like to welcome you to a panel discussion on the future of the collective experience. I would like to introduce you to the panel. We have from O Open House, Lim Soo Pei.
Hi.
And Kirti Upadhyaya. And from Daily tous jours, we have Mouna Andraos.
Hello.
As well as Melissa Mongiat.
Hi, everyone.
Ladies, welcome. So let's get started with introductions to what you do. Perhaps we could have Rafi bring up the slideshow for O Open House.
Hi. Thanks, Nadia. For friends who don't know about Open House, we are best known for our art walks. What we do is we bring art into neighborhoods, into strangers' homes and private spaces. We've done a lot of interesting shows, including turning a two-story house into a museum of curiosities. We've transformed unused public spaces of apartment flats into art galleries, so you can walk from the top floor and walk all the way down to the bottom to look at different artworks, basically turning the whole apartment block into a vertical gallery. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, we are best known for our neighborhood art walks, where volunteer guides actually bring you on a walking tour, visiting strangers' homes, and you look at artworks commissioned by O. That talks about the stories about the people living there, about the history of the space, how it's related to the larger history of Singapore. And during such times, of course, we can no longer do all these large-scale collective-based programs. So what can we do? We look forward to sharing more about it later. I'll pass over to Kirti to share more.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Supe said and share that a lot of our experiences are made by a community for the community. We work not just with artists, but often hosts who open up their houses to us, tell us their stories, and work with the artists to create experiences, as well as a lot of volunteers to bring these events to life. So recent times have been challenging for us because we're not allowed to visit these people, to hang out in their spaces, hear their stories, and share them with other people. So we're quite excited to share a bit about perhaps how we've been navigating keeping the spirit of O and creating these experiences that come from each and every one of us and try to bring them online. Yeah. As you can see, some of the photos are of some of the things we managed to do before in the past when more than 5 people could gather in a space. You can see that there are groups gathering outside different houses, people interacting with the artworks, which is incredibly fun when the artist creates something that, changes as you interact with it. And also the amount of people in one space. Everyone in the red and white shirts are our volunteer tour guides who essentially bring almost every single art walk or art experience we've done to life in some way or the other as our representatives. Yeah, I think this is somebody's home in Tiong Bahru that they kindly opened up to an artist, and they co-created an experience with an artist to kind of share their stories and share their experiences with a lot of different people through this program that we call AYO, Art in Your Own Home. And I think the next 2 slides will sort of show how different our experiences start to look when you go online. So you only have a screen, and that's kind of something interesting for us. Yeah. That's the last picture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirti. I am looking at all these slides and remembering my own experiences with O Open House, and I thoroughly miss, just going to someone's home, experiencing new art, and it was always in such a convivial kind of atmosphere. So I agree with you, it's something that all of us miss. Now we're going to go to Daily tous jours, where Melissa and Mouna are going to share with us what they do.
Hi, yes. So we've been working on collective experiences, gathering people together in public space for about 10 years now. One of our signature projects is our musical swings that get people to swing together and make music. We see this as an exercise in collaboration. There you have a little video just to show a little aperçu of the experience. So our studio is all about creating urban rituals, trying to see how we can get people to collaborate on an everyday basis and bring magic and ignite in people a sense of what's possible. You have another video of our project in Dubai, which is Musical Shadows. It's an interactive pavement that enables people to make music with their shadows.
Our studio's passion has been about trying to create opportunities for people to engage in the public space, maybe strangers who don't know each other, people from different generations. And through these opportunities, we believe we have the ability to bring a little bit of joy and also strengthen the ties between people and make communities that are ultimately more resilient and stronger together. So definitely we'll be looking forward to sharing what this purpose has kind of become through the pandemic and the difficulties that we've had right now in creating these public space collective experiences.
What you just saw is Walk, Walk, Dance. It's actually a little prototype that we did this summer. The studio code name for this project is the Pandemic Project. It's an interface. It's musical lines on the ground that enable you to make music with your feet, 6 feet apart. We created it in response to the current sanity measures in our city, where touch is not encouraged and people need to be aware of the distance between them in order to be safe. So the work always keeps this distance between people, yet they're making them do something together. It's a way to have fun with the rules.
The sanity measures are kind of interesting. Mishap from Melissa, the sanitary message, of course, but the sanitary measures. But in a way, these were about trying to keep sanity in these days. So inviting people to still embrace the outdoor space, encourage kind of the healthy behaviors that we can have, and still creating opportunities for connecting with each other. So that's a little overview of what the studio's been doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So I think we have a great snapshot of what Open House and Daily tous les jours were doing pre-pandemic and after the pandemic, right? I think nowadays life feels like it's a pre and a post-pandemic sort of state. So I thought to just start off with like how we've been coping with the pandemic. I mean, it was great to see the project that you did, but what are the restrictions and general mood like, you know, in Singapore and in Montreal when the pandemic first hit, and I guess right now, how's it going? Maybe Melissa and Mouna, you can start.
Yeah. So back in March and April, when the pandemic hit, the city was hit very badly, but mainly the the contamination was concentrated in elder care centers. Yet at some point, we were one of the 7th most dangerous cities in the world. And the measures were very strong, the sanity measures. And we found out that most of our work was actually illegal. We couldn't gather physically in public space anymore. It was prohibited. And so it was a chance for us to actually regroup and do some research, interview our peers or collaborators, and try to understand what the future of all this is. Is it the end, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think that's like a common thread that's come through. Like people thought it was a time to kind of slow down and do things that we couldn't do before the pandemic, or felt like we didn't have time to do. What about for you, Supe and Kirti? What were the immediate reactions in March, and then how did you keep busy?
We were still hopeful, actually. In Singapore, our circuit breaker or lockdown version only started in April. Back then, we spent 2 years on a very big project called Wood, where we want to bring our art walk into abandoned factories in the northern part of Singapore. And it's an international show where we have artists from Germany, from UK coming down. So imagine 2 years of effort, and in March we were still hopeful, maybe we can delay it for 6 months. So when the circuit breaker was announced, it was scary. And then we were still a bit hopeful, but I think sometime in May, when it was announced that they're going to extend the circuit breaker, and we knew that we cannot pull it off anymore. And then we came together and okay, we have to switch gears. So what else can we do now? We have to drop everything we did for the past 2 years and think of something else. Yeah. So it was, I guess, really sad for all of us involved, having spent so much effort on something that has not been realized yet.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's such disappointment, I think, in not all the work that's been done. So, how do you cope with that? On a personal and as a collective, I guess, with the team, how do you move forward with that? What do you guys do to commiserate, to, kind of think how you can maybe package this and put this for the future? What happened with that?
Kirti, you want to take this?
Sure.
I think on a personal...
it's kind of strange, right? It comes and goes in waves, I feel like. And I think the weirdest thing about this was that it wasn't local, it was global. And every time something resolved locally, something would happen internationally. And you're sort of just what is the after effect of this, right? So I think it was quite hard to deal with on a personal level. It was a lot easier to deal with technically for work, because there are certain things that are you have to do, in the sense of you still want projects to go out, you still want to work with the community, you still want to create something, and ideally also create something that speaks to the time, rather than just sort of is parachuted from the pre-COVID era into this weird in-between stage that we're in. So it was interesting, where I would argue that coping with work, it's a lot more solid, because you can still create. Coping with life is who really knows what's going to happen, right? I think we're all still in the stage where it's October. This year happened. Yeah. So
yeah, exactly.
It's interesting. Yeah. I think we found a lot of time to talk about things we don't talk about usually, though. What is it that we want to do next, or differently, or how can we use different platforms? So that was also interesting, and I think one of the ways that we could come to terms with these realities. Yeah.
Okay. I think that kind of brings it back to the idea of how what you do is really important, right? About bringing different groups of people together in unexpected ways. So I wanted to ask you about that, why has there been such an emphasis placed on the social in your work, and how is it more important than ever in the pandemic and post-pandemic times? Maybe Mouna or Melissa, you can start us off with this.
Yes, definitely. For us, it's always been about people and bringing people together. Our very first large project, the musical swings, were originally created as an exercise in collaborative, collaborative cooperation. One of the motto of Daily tous les jours is to be able to transmit the message that together we can do more than when we're alone. And so in many ways, that vision and that idea became more relevant in the context of the pandemic. As we are kind of split apart, we need to find ways to reconnect, and we know that the solutions will only come from kind of global cooperation in many ways, working with each other across different homes, locally, and different countries, of course, and continents and cities internationally. So I think very much in a similar way, work has been an anchor and a place to cope and deal, and also to realize that there's no choice but to get back to work and think about how we can continue pursuing our mission in a new context, but with still looking at the kind of tremendous importance of the impact that we can bring.
Yeah, definitely. I wondered also about, the typical process you have in coming up with ideas for innovative, inclusive projects. And maybe you could talk about that as well, in the context of how you did that in the pandemic. Because I'm hearing that, the idea was then to sort of put on hold all the projects that were supposed to go ahead but couldn't, and to rethink what else could be done. So what is your typical process in coming up with a project?
Well, the typical process is usually around a deep understanding of a site, of its people, and the stories. That's normally where it starts from. Understanding a site means also understanding the physicality, but also the psychogeographies, the stories, the history, the official stories, the unofficial stories, sometimes even the gossip, and also the people, where they're from, what they do, the current people we want to attract, and also the potential audience that could be in the work. Working in a lot in cities, we have a very site-specific approach, but a bit like we saw with the swings, something universal often comes out from this process. Now, back to today, the pandemic, we didn't necessarily go on hold. We continued working. Some projects, a lot of our projects are very long-term, so we could still do the research, and also a big part of our work is doing prototype. So we were still continuing that, but it felt pressing to understand the future of where we were heading. And so a big chunk of our team started doing research, and like I said, interviewing and reading everywhere. Articles that were coming out were very doomsday scenarios, where it's as if like the first people who want to talk had some of the most pessimistic views ever, where we were never going to gather anymore, and that the new city was going to be organized in a way that you never have to see your neighbor. But we found out that it's actually super important to see your neighbor and to have a sense that that strangers actually are connected. And the current crisis actually proves how much collaboration is needed, tangible collaboration between people who don't know each other, in order to all together stay safe. So that was interesting, and it, in the end, made us believe more than ever in what we do. Like just to have these informal connections are super important to create like the basis for the bigger things we need to do together.
For sure. What about for you, Supe and Kirti?
Could you remind me of the question? I just resonated with what was shared.
Yeah, for sure.
No, because I think we were just
wondering
thinking
about the process that you have, and I think maybe you can pick up on the site specificity that Melissa brought up, because when she said that, both of you were nodding like, yes, that's right. So
that's why I got lost.
How does that work now in the pandemic, when there isn't like a physical site that you go to necessarily? How do you then plan the new projects or plan to go ahead? Yeah.
I think what was interesting to us was that even before the pandemic happened, one of the things we were starting to think about was time and space in a more kind of broader than just a particular neighborhood or a location. We had done all these like small projects that kind of explored the idea of anchoring an art experience to a particular festival or a particular date that somebody was that was part of our calendar. I think what we didn't expect was that we were going to have to start to think about these things a lot sooner, because actually we deeply relate to the work that you guys are doing as well. Because when you were saying that we generally research a neighborhood, we talk to people there, we find out all the stories, both the ones that, you know, are very familiar to us and the ones that only the people in the neighborhood know about, and sort of connect with all of that and then create an art experience out of it, right? But now we have like just essentially switched gear for a little while to think about, instead of the internet or as a space, or to think about the digital and what is possible in terms of storytelling there, and thinking instead about Singapore and all the people here who are experiencing this global phenomenon. So I think that it became interesting because our research wasn't so much oriented to space in the sense of a physical neighborhood anymore, and we had to put that aside for a little while and start to think about sort of how do we think about stories related to this particular time instead, and this moment. So that's kind of what we're doing right now, and that's changed some of the ways in which we work, because we also used to have, I don't think as long as you guys, but quite a long process. Like the project that we did Wood for 2 years was the longest that we've, I think, spent on one, but usually it does take us a year from like initially getting to know a space to creating something within that space, right? And now it's like COVID happened and we're trying to respond to it artistically, and the timeline has shrunk. So it's very interesting. The creative process has become more experimental also for us. Yeah. We're basically learning how to create a digital experience right now, and to interact and experiment with people via a website instead. Yeah.
Okay. And do you think that the pandemic has opened up or hastened new ways of working or engaging with your audience? I mean, beyond just like thinking about using a digital platform to engage with audiences, you know, but just kind of like making you think really hard about how to pivot while waiting on going back to what was like previously. How do you balance that? Like, how do you balance the expectations with the reality, I guess, is my question.
I guess at the end of the day, at open house, we believe that the experience itself is very important. Of course, we also have to work a lot. The good thing about us is we will work with different artists, depending on their practice, what topics are we tackling. So all these artists also show us different ways to think about different things, and to do things differently. For instance, we are working with this digital producer who's an internet artist. Okay, he doesn't call himself internet artist, but an artist who works with the internet, and he does very strange things of like setting a website, having a lot of pop-ups and interactive elements to just, instead of just having a website. So talking to people like that, you kind of have more ideas, and you also do your own research in trying to think of how else can we use the digital beyond it as being like just a platform, but as a medium in itself. You don't want to just take what's offline and then make it in the video and just put it online. At the end of the day, we are fighting with like Netflix. We are fighting with a lot of entertainment, and so I guess the challenge is that how do you make yourself different? And if we go back to the topic of collective experience, we do ask ourselves, like, because open house has always been about a lot of human elements. Instead of there's volunteers bringing you through the spaces, you get to talk to people. If the volunteer homeowners are there or the artists are there, you can actually talk to them. And all these human elements are all lost when you go online and try to design an experience. So how do we navigate that? I think that's the question we are all trying to answer, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point you brought up. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, this makes me think of at some point in our research, I think it was Naomi Klein who in an interview was saying, we're all in this big tech experiment, and none of us like it. Like we're like, we need the physical contact. We can't just live our lives behind our screens with this impression of connection. We need this. We need physical stuff.
Yeah. And I thought, I mean, from what Supi said about, you know, the idea that you could talk to an artist or a homeowner, and what Melissa, you're saying now about how we can live our lives behind screens, I think it's because when you're in person, you can have these random, spontaneous sort of interactions Whereas for the digital, it just seems really timed and I don't know, intentional and limited.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Do you feel the same with that? And is that also the challenge of creating digital experiences?
Yeah, for us, I think it was never an option to do virtual. We considered it for maybe a week where we looked at all our projects and said, okay, what is the virtual version of that project? And we could come up with decent ideas of how to make people sing with each other from everywhere in the world or dance with each other and follow different moves. And then we realized that wasn't the right place for us to put our energy. Of course, in reality, just being here with you today, and what does here mean in this virtual space when you're in Singapore and we're in Montreal is part of the things that I think we have to bring with us in the future as a positive opportunities that the virtual give us. But for us, it stays there really as a way to bridge very long distances. But hopefully for the short ones, we can continue doing the personal thing.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to my next question about, how you were in Singapore last year with Weekend Dance, right, for SIFA, and you were going to bring musical swings this year, had the pandemic not forbidden it. So I wanted to ask, you were also talking about how, wanted to bring people together virtually in like a global space. What do you think are the universal themes or reactions that come through repeatedly wherever you bring your projects? So how do people normally react, and like what kind of like rejuvenates you, from looking at their reactions as well?
Yeah. What we work very hard for is the sense of collaboration, the sense of video connection to the other person that you don't necessarily know. That's like always the premise of all our work, how to connect people who don't know. Even if Lucy, even if they're and then the reactions are always nice, and I think what we is us with what we've prepared for them to how our interactive scenario, thinking of how people with Weekend Dance, how people start to make up their own choreographies, how with the music they can actually place for a picnic or hangout. It completely transforms the area in something that feels more like a plaza. These kinds of surprises are always what we strive and what wakes us up in the morning. And then in terms of themes to get there, we have a lot of different tools. Music is for sure a recurrent theme because has this universal quality. It's also a way to move not just the mind, but area to body. And that takes. So we're so much in our head when we're in public space, on our phone. Nice to get out more in the body with others.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up also because, you're saying that while we are on our phones a lot in public spaces as well. So it's like a kind of like a lesson at some point. It's like we crave the physical interaction so much, but then before we were not doing that, right? We were kind of behind our screens. And I'm not sure whether we've learned the lesson actually, because I still feel like because now we're encouraged to be much more digital, then it kind of cultivates that bad habit, even as we are learning that, actually, that's not how we want to be. What do you think about it, Mouna? I know like Melissa was cutting it out a little bit, but that's definitely something that I wanted to pick up. Maybe Mouna, you can expand on that a little.
Yes, I know. It's hard to imagine. It was hard to imagine 6 months ago that we could be even more spending time on our devices and various machines. To go back to your original question, I wanted to mention we did a study a few years ago on the social and economic impact of the musical swings as they traveled through a variety of cities in the US. And we were interested both by the economic impact so that we can build an argument, a positive argument, hopefully, for why these kinds of art interventions can really help support a variety of different actors in the cities when we arrive, businesses and different people working around the project. But of course, our heart was more passionate about getting some feedback on the social impact. And that's been a driver for a lot of what we do. And so we interviewed about 1,000 people, and the interviewees asked them 3 keywords that came to mind after they experienced the musical swings. And 9 out of 10 people just used the word happy. And so just that for us is definitely something that we carry through our work. If we can bring that happiness or that moment of joy and celebration, then we know we've created something worth pursuing and continuing. And I think these are feelings that are...
Yeah, definitely.
This makes thing. There's also a super important impact that we're trying to reach in these informal connections between strangers. Is something we saw with the swings, is how we can also help urban issues such as loneliness, but also we saw there's this beautiful testimony in West Palm Beach of a boy who was seeing the installation, and he was explaining how where it was located was just in the middle of two, like one of the poorest and one of the richest neighborhoods in the United States. And every people from both sides come together. And I think that is also, how can we use happiness and joy, kind of bring down barriers and just have this communal space.
Yeah, that's really poetic, especially since it's actually literally swinging from one to the other. That's
true.
What about for you, Kirti and Supe? Like, what have been the reactions, from visitors to Open House? I mean, it's definitely a very popular event here in Singapore, and people go every year and they're interested to, I think, partly to see inside people's homes, but the experience in itself is something that kind of gathers everyone and is really uplifting in itself. Could you share with us some of the reactions that you have recorded, maybe? Or just informal feedback that you've received from people who visited? What are the keywords, if you will, for their experiences?
I think as a person working on the art side, of course, it's like super, it's very a happy reality when someone discovers an artist they didn't know, or sort of like sees a work that they didn't previously think they could engage with, and it finds a new way to interact with art very generally. I think that's something that O takes great pride in, making art accessible to people and sort of like inviting them to be a part of the conversation. But I think the reactions that I remember the most are usually when people tell us that they didn't know something about this neighborhood, they didn't know this place existed or this story existed. And it applies to almost any single place that we go. There's always somebody who discovers something different about it. Like, there are really specific things as well, but I think the story that kind of stays with me always is when we did our art walk in Holland Village, we produced a journal with some stories that we collected from a lot of the longtime shop owners or shop residents of this Strata Mall. So it's quite old, it's quite kind of like grungy compared to all the like 5-star malls in Singapore, right? And they told us about their experience of being there over the many years that they've been there. And then we published it in a little booklet, and we decided to send it to like a lot of the residents in the neighborhood for free. We were just like, let's just mail it to them. And people wrote into us saying that they were really happy to find this, that they've been there for really long and they found stories that they vaguely remembered or never remembered before. And it's this reaction of like getting to know your city again and getting to know this place that you thought maybe was boring or not very fun or inspiring, and see it in a new light. And that's kind of the most heartwarming side of it, I guess. So, do you have any other specific instances? Yeah.
I think generally people, when they write in, they say that, or they share on social media, they will say that, I fell in love with this neighborhood. I think one of the most proud moment is that we have this couple who went on a first date on our program. And then they fell in love with Tiong Bahru. We had a walk in Tiong Bahru. And then they decided, when they got married, after they got married, they decided that they want to live in Tiong Bahru. And when we did, just now, the program that Kirti mentioned, Art Leader Own Home, they actually volunteered their house and shared this story to everyone on how they actually met And then they fell in love with the neighborhood, and then they actually settled down there. Yeah, I think that's a I guess a winning story. We can also bring it to property agents and say, oh, you see, our program has some benefits, some economic
Yes,
benefits.
there's the collaboration right there. Well, that's a really nice kind of full circle story. Um, yeah, I think, all these, I think the collective experience, right, coming back to the idea for this panel, it's just that it uplifts, it makes people feel less lonely, it makes people feel happier. And I wonder then for Melissa and Mouna, you are doing this project called Better Together, Reflections for Pandemic Times. It's part of a research through which you have been reading, observing, listening, interviewing peers from around the world on what to make of collective experiences and public spaces in pandemic times. What have been the key observations you've made from this, and how will you translate it into your upcoming work? And perhaps, provide a roadmap for others as well.
Yes, so we tried to do it in a very pragmatic way so that we can inform our design process through that research. And so we came up with a cheat sheet of maybe 20 items that we should consider when designing new projects for the public sphere, anywhere from really thinking about the choreography between people and how they move through space, and how the distance that we need to keep between us as we survive through this pandemic can become an asset to work from, to designing things maybe that are either out of sync or in different places at the same time. So imagining all sorts of ways to connect people with each other through these pandemic times and beyond, going beyond touch itself into all the other senses and all the other ways to respond to our environment. And so that became an opportunity for us to inspire and infuse our own creative process again, and develop opportunities for ideas to emerge, things like the Walk Walk Dance project that you saw as the third video that we showed a little bit earlier. We've also shared some of these insights with our peers and the community at large online, and that has sparked some conversations and opportunities for continuing to renew these criteria as we move forward.
Well, I'm seeing
I
some
think of
questions coming from the audience. Go ahead, Melissa.
No, that's okay. I was just going to add that overall, the research made us more confident in what we're working for, and also was a way to find opportunities in all the restrictions that are right now. And actually, there's a way to even do what we do even better, like more sensory, more raise awareness even more, and even add more depth.
Yeah, I think like a heightened sense of purpose as well from the interview process. I have some questions that have come in through Facebook at the same time, so I think I'm just gonna like mash them up with my own, and then we can have a conversation all together. So this question is from Martini Ali Wafa, and she asked, how has the crisis transformed our relationship with public spaces? What do you think? I mean, kind of jumping off from what you found out with this project, how do you think the crisis has transformed our relationship with public spaces?
I think it's making public spaces, I think our relationship is becoming more profound in many ways collectively. I think the conversation around what is the role and place of a public space is suddenly in everyone's mind. As professionals working in that field, we are constantly talking about public space, this and the other, but it was really us. I don't think the general public really made these distinctions, but suddenly with the pandemic and the different measures, everybody became aware of what that thing is, the public sphere that is a shared open space for all, which in lots of contexts we hope is a safe space as well. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see that as more eyes are put in our public spaces, that hopefully we can see them flourish and evolve even more and take on a variety of roles, both a social role, but also an environmental role, also a role in situations that can be kind of extreme, as we might be facing more and more of these in the context of climate changes occurring. And so it's an exciting time, I think, actually, for public space at large everywhere.
And it's an extension of that question. I have another one from Ting Ziyun, who is asking about the long-term impacts of the pandemic on public spaces. Even as we see like restrictions are lifted in respective cities, but kind of like sometimes put back on again. What do you think is that long-term impact about the way we are thinking about the public space, especially now, like you said, the general person is much more aware of the concept of a public space?
Yeah, it's more important than ever. So I think long term is this attachment that we have to public space and how important it is to generate this care and connection so that we can be together to face what's ahead of us. I think because of its importance, hopefully people will care about it and do what is necessary to protect it. Just like our natural environment, the commons are key to have the collaboration that is needed to face because the problems are bigger and bigger. And another thing, like besides the sanitary crisis, is also this. I think we see the power of when we get together. And where we can get together is there in public spaces. So we need to keep that.
Okay, I think a related question I have is about the idea of private space then. I mean, even as we're talking now in a public virtual space, we are all in our private spaces. So how do we navigate that, or how do we harness that if we can, through the projects that you guys do to still stimulate the collective experience? Maybe Supe and Kirti, you could talk a bit about that, because you're saying that you're trying to see how to bring the virtual experience that is not just sort of like a replication of a physical into the virtual. How do you see that working out in the private space?
This is a very interesting and challenging question. I think to share maybe a bit of context of what we're trying to do, right? One of our biggest concerns is sort of like that limbo of when you have like 5 people on a virtual screen, it doesn't feel very real, right? And so we're trying to play with hybrids where, how some of us are allowed to be together in certain spaces because the rules are a bit like constantly flexing and changing. I think one of the interesting things for us was like how many people have to be in one room to make it feel alive, and then translate that virtually to the people who can't be there. So we're trying to create these things that we call viewing parties, where maybe 2 or 3 people are constructing an experience together that they share with other people virtually. And that's kind of how we bleed the semi-public space with the semi-private space and then bring it all together. Because I think that's a major challenge for us, right? Like, the private space is not really private if we're always putting it on Zoom or we're always putting it online. Because then what happens to that room that used to be your safe space, essentially? It's now on display for the world. I mean, I've never been happier that I redid my room before this happened, kind of thing, right? So we're trying to figure out where the boundaries are and how to blur it. It's very difficult. I think also one of the interesting things that we are finding is that private space is also so vastly different, and to be able to have the private space is also a privilege. So I think also being aware of how we mediate that over time. This is a slightly messy question. All this to say, I don't think I figured it out, and a lot of our artists are also trying to deal with it. Like, how do we deal with space when it has to take on so many roles and it has to achieve so much in so little, right? And that's some of the work that they're coming to terms with too.
Yeah, that's it's a really hard thing to do. And you're right, because the rules keep changing and we keep on having to kind of like predict what's going to happen next, what's going to be allowed next. So then it's like, how do we kind of work our way around it, right? What are the loopholes, so to speak? I think this kind of relates to a question I'm seeing from an audience member called Sean Teo, who's asking, is there some way to make digital or online events more interactive beyond screen time? And I think you kind of talked about that a bit, where you said like there were these viewing parties where it's sort of like a blended mode of viewing. Do you see that also happening in a physical space, where you sort of then, do something in a physical space, but with some online activation? Because I think now the idea is sort of like more online, less physical. But do you kind of see that moving towards, like a more balanced kind of mix?
I think as all open house, we're certainly hoping that's going to be possible soon. I think the interesting thing is what you mentioned is exactly what we're thinking about. We're also trying to run an alternative version of the viewing party where the people gather in a real space to interact with the digital artwork. So the volunteer is present to help them navigate this virtual space that happens to be the exhibition space. And so it's this kind of like inverted thing, right? You can either choose to be in your private space engaging with a kind of semi-public gathering, or you can choose to be in the public space interacting with the digital, and then you can go home and look at it again from a different point of view. So we're trying to figure out how to sort of make the screen adaptable. It's really difficult though, because you need the screen, right? There always needs to be something for the digital to exist on. It's just more interesting if it's not a flat screen. So we're trying to figure out how to like kind of break outside of the computer or the projector screen. But
Yeah.
I think all this to say, it all depends on where the rules go. Yeah.
Yeah. I hear you, and I think the idea of the experience is also really difficult to understand, because the experience. Okay, so for example, in art, you can have an online viewing room where you can be in like a particular place and you can kind of navigate with your cursor and whatnot. Then there is like that very flat kind of experience where you just scroll down and see the same artworks, for example. So I feel like there's some kind of link between what you're saying and what I've also been thinking about. So how do you kind of get that collectivity, that kind of collective experience where you're literally interacting with people, whether it's in real time, in real space? I feel like now we're talking in like different dimensions, but in real time, in real space. Because of course now we're talking in real time, in real space, but then it doesn't seem very real because I'm not seeing you in the flesh. So, well, kind of like jumping off from that question, I think there is this really pent up demand to be outside, to be with others. And in that sense, are you guys like planning some kind of like big to do, when things are super open and like, you can't wait to break free and it's gonna be amazing when it happens? Clearly, I'm feeling very optimistic tonight, so yeah. Sorry, I can't hear Mouna.
We can't hear Mouna.
Oh, okay,
I said
my bad.
There you go.
Okay.
we're coming to Singapore with the musical swings as soon as this is over. That's what we're doing.
Exactly. Yeah, can't wait to experience that. So I guess the next
maybe
question that leads from. Go ahead.
I was just going to say something interesting with like outside, inside, and the current measures. And one thing, I mean, it's interesting because right now Montreal just moved into the red alert, and we're back to kind of more severe lockdown rules. But this summer there was this idea of hybrid spaces that was quite interesting, and it kind of reaches with what you girls are working on. Is this, how can your front porch be the new plaza? Like many people, you can't meet you can't meet outside, but there were a lot of informal, like, hey, what's up, in front of people's houses, where you can even sometimes like share a drink, but still complying with the rules. And it seemed that this idea of, and then like more greenery was needed, so streets became kind of parks. And we were extrapolating this in our research. If the front porch is the new plaza, also the backyard became the farm, as many people were, with all that panic buying, people were kind of trying to be more autonomous. So the backyard is the farm, the front porch is the plaza, the street is the new park, and maybe the block party is the new festival to a certain extent. There was these scales that are all mixing up that can maybe be where we bridge our practices, where we bring the party just a little bit outside, and we bring the public space just a bit inside.
That sounds so encouraging, because it's like, while we're doing the digital, I think instinctively we're all kind of moving towards like, but how can we within our confines still interact physically without, endangering each other? So I have another question here from Lisa Lip that I think extends from what we've just talked about. She asks, do you see collective experiences leaning towards more digital, less physical experiences beyond 2020? Or do you think there's a way to flip the emphasis back to the physical? I think generally in this panel, we're all like, yes, let's go for the physical, but, kind of looking at it from the top down and at like all the other, I guess, existing collective experiences, do you think it's gonna be towards that blended mode? Or do you think once, we can interact again, it's just gonna be all physical and we're not gonna like bother with the digital?
I have a... Oh, sorry, Steve, do you want to go first? Oh,
No, you
okay.
go first.
I was just going to say that I think in Singapore, it's always been a natural thing to consider the digital. It's a push that you see happening across society. It's not just about art. It's really about the smart nation and going online and all these things, right? So I don't think that it's ever going to flip back to kind of not being digital anymore. And you see everyone is trying to have more of a digital presence because it also gives you longevity and reach in a way that something physical in a country like Singapore might not, right? So when we were planning our really big project, the 2-year-long Wood, we always wanted a microsite, and we always wanted to think about how maybe after, because all our events are ephemeral, they happen for like 1 month, maybe 3 months, and then they disappear. And there's no way to share all of the stories and the work and the energy that has been put into it with other people, except to go online, right? Or to create a physical book, but I mean, that aside. That was always a question for us. I just think it came a lot faster and it became a lot more overwhelming. So I think once all of this is over, it'll probably pace back to a more normal kind of like, what is the natural way to go digital with this, rather than we have to go digital. If not, this isn't going to exist. Yeah, so I think that will be a balance. And it'll be a nice balance. We'll be good at it by then because now we learned how to do it. Yeah.
I think you've hit something on the head. I mean, the idea of being ephemeral. Do you think that's actually the magic sauce for collective experiences? The fact that it exists and then it goes away, and so it's something to be treasured. And does the digital take away from that magicality of the collective experience? What do you guys think?
I don't think it does actually, because at the end of the day, whatever you experience online is different from the offline. You really just don't have that human touch. Like, although we are all looking at each other, but we still feel very distant. So I don't think it can ever replace. And I agree, of course, with Kirti as well, that, and at the end of the day, we spend so much effort during this period trying to unlock what truly is a good digital experience. And it's really a pity if you just, because things are back to normal and you just throw it away. I think that's not the way to go, lah. But how do you seamlessly marry the digital and the real life into a full experience, instead of like, if you see this, you can go online and see it again, revisit it. But how can it bring a full suite of experience to you? I think that's where Open House, I guess, will try to answer in the future. There probably will be a flip back to the physical, but the digital will still be there, definitely be there. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I have a question stemming from that, I think. I think I want to also pick up something that Melissa was saying earlier about how, people are trying to be creative about using their home and their neighborhoods to interact naturally with each other, or to interact very intentionally with each other. So what else has been heartening for you to witness within your local art and design community, or more broadly in the global art and design community? How have people come together digitally or otherwise to support each other in this difficult time?
Well, I think for us, the closing of the borders were quite significant. We work a lot internationally, and suddenly that that wasn't available as much. So it became an opportunity to look closer locally and see how we could start again to bring our own expertise in connecting people with each other, to the city here, to our neighborhoods here, and do work and present some of that work here. But at the same time, in parallel, we started conversations about a different way to work internationally. And that's a conversation that we had started thinking about before, in the light of kind of the climate crisis that we're in and looming ahead. We realized that maybe we have to change the model of how we work and not just travel all the time everywhere, shipping things from one place to the other, but rather continuing to make these connections, but working more with local resources as well. So the crisis has accelerated opportunities for different ways of working internationally with local partners that are stronger, where we're more collaborative, where we're hoping we can continue to expand our reach, but in a different ways. So in that sense, it's been something we, again, hope to pursue, and the digital is supporting us tremendously in that. We're trying to think about methodologies even to deploy our work without being there. How do we use the remote connection? Do we have to move into VR in order to be able to fully experience what it's going to be? These are the types of questions that we're asking ourselves right now.
Okay, what about for you, Supe and Kirti? Have you witnessed anything heartening, within your own community, for open house, or with your partners? For example, the ones that you were with on Wood, like has there been any kind of support, or heartening kind of reach outs that you've experienced?
I think it's quite okay. So within open house, because we are supported actually by a lot of volunteers, on our database we have 600 of them. About 100 of them are very active. So when they know where we are heading to, that we're doing this big wood project. So when we announced it in our group on Facebook, they all give us very encouraging words, such as like, "Oh, we'll get through this together," and the fact that they use the word "we," the sense of collectiveness actually really gave you a lot more strength than than you are alone, or us as a team, that actually they are there behind us, and they're there to support us if we need. I think in terms of the local scene, I was actually very, very impressed that the three theatre groups like SRT, Wild Rice, and Pandemonium actually came together to release a short show, and to call for people to support the theatre. I think this pandemic actually gave a chance for people to not think about competing, but to come together to overcome the crisis a lot more. Yeah.
That's a really good point you brought up, and I think there was also a really receptive audience, because I think at the time we were still in lockdown and there wasn't much we could do. Like, museums and libraries were closed, just like they are now in Montreal, and so there was a ready audience. I'm just wondering, now we're kind of straddling that, like we're going out, but we're also still digital kind of sphere. And I'm wondering whether you think that, like, now we really have to make the digital super amazing to capture any audience, because they have more options, right? They can go out, they can do other things. What do you think about that? Because I thought, I did a conference where we like had half of it sort of in circuit breaker, and then like we had 2 talks, I think that was outside, and we were so worried like people weren't gonna come for the last 2, because now they had options, like you said, with the Netflix earlier.
Yeah, I think I guess at the start of the pandemic, I think the community's reaction is, okay, what can we get it out there the fastest? So for instance, the theatre groups has got their recordings of their previous shows, so they put it online, right? So that's fast and easy. But as people start settling down, and the arts community come together and think about what else can we do, then you start seeing a lot more fun and sophisticated work. Like one of the productions that one of our volunteers attended actually made use of the Zoom mechanism to stage a murder show. So you get to go into different breakout rooms, follow different characters, try to understand, in the end, analyze who is the murderer, and things like that. So if given time, I'm sure there are a lot more challenges, but I think the arts community and the creative community can still come up with more stuff and interesting stuff. It's also a good thing. Then we know that the quality must be there. It cannot just be a mere, translation. Yeah.
So true. I think one other thread that's been brought up is also the idea of archiving. I think, the digital space seems to be really great for archiving work that's been done. And I know that so many artists, galleries, they and theater groups, and I guess for you guys, you've also been thinking about how to document what has happened, of things that have passed and of things that are coming up. So do you feel like this pandemic and I guess the opening of the digital space has really forced you to look at this as something you need to do rather than something you can do?
I think with what you said earlier, what we do is very much in the ephemeral. So archival has always been a big part of it. If you don't document any work, you just don't have nothing. So yeah, I think maybe the sharing of the archive is happening a bit more, as we can't have the real thing happening as much as usual.
Definitely. What about for you, Supa and Kirti? I mean, you talked about like the booklet that you made and things like that. So you've been quite experimental as well in how you document your projects. So how are you gonna do that moving forward? Is it gonna be more in the digital space as well and making it more available for everyone to read, to access?
I think that was a dream of ours, to start putting things online a bit more. And also, I think we've always been curious about the digital because there are people who've been doing it so well for so long, right? And how can we make our stories live and interact with people? I think the challenge is sort of going beyond the I put a web page up and maybe somebody will read the web page one day element of it, right? Like, how do you also make the archive interesting? How do you make it represent or reflect what your organization believes in its mechanics and not just content? I think that's the challenging and interesting question that we have time for. So one of the new projects that we're doing, because it's virtual, we also had to think about how, like, if people stumble into this, what will they interact with? How will they see the artworks? What will they understand in the stories? So I think we're also trying to take the storytelling element of it very seriously when we do create an archive, because it can't just be information. It still needs to have a kind of thread running through it that engages people. So I think that's been that will probably be the thing that we spend more time focusing on. How do we take the kind of inspiration behind all of our projects and the journals and the physical things we create and make them go virtual, essentially?
Yeah, for sure.
But we're definitely going to archive more, and we'll be better at it. Is what yeah.
Okay. And I wanted to talk about something maybe a bit more serious about budgets, because I think, a lot of businesses are thinking about how they're going to keep afloat, how they're going to ride out the storm of the pandemic. And I wonder if that's something on your minds as well. And, how do you navigate that?
Interesting. I think we normally always have a kind of site-specific commissions is usually the largest chunk of our work. And with the pandemic, I think Wak Wak Dance is the first project that we are creating in a way that it's easily exportable and is really made for export. And that is maybe something that we've changed so that it's a different business model and enables multiple presentation to make it's kind of sharing the costs on different presentations.
It's so hard to know what the future will hold and which part of the economy will kick in first. That one of our strategies has been just to try to diversify as well. So kind of look at different models, different ways of working. I was talking about partnerships earlier, maybe licensing, developing projects internally. So it's for sure something on our mind right now. And so we're kind of trying a variety of things, hoping something will hold.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if you have governmental support as well in Montreal, like with the Conseil des Arts de Montreal. Is there any support from there?
Yeah.
Oh,
Definitely,
yeah.
it's been critical. The Canadian government at a federal level pretty early on decided to adopt a model of instead of having people go automatically on how do you call it in English? Unemployment insurance, because they saw that the numbers were dropping. Then they created these subsidies for employers to be able to keep their employees and instead work on economic re-stimuli projects while they're waiting for the wave to kind of pass a little bit. So the support has been critical in our ability to continue doing our work.
Okay, great. I mean, I know that it's the same in Singapore. There is tremendous government support. Supi and Kirti, could you talk a bit about how that has helped you guys ride out the storm as well?
I mean, I guess there are two trenches, right? One is where it's for everyone, which is like the job support scheme where the government supports wages actually, or for Singaporeans. That definitely helped a lot. And then there is the arts and culture specific budget, which was 55 million to help the industry. I mean, I like to use the example and say that if the government has set aside this, then they obviously have thought that the arts and culture is worth supporting, and eventually that is important. And so it trickled down to the Arts Council giving out the money as digital grant or training grant. They helped, of course, additional money, but at the same time, I agree with Lisa and Mouna that we're also trying to find new models, because at the end of the day, at Open House, we believe that art should be paid, and we always charge ticketing fees. But now we go online, you're competing with so many things free, and people has this impression that online is free, right? Why should I be paying money? So what kind of model can you use to charge for the experiences? Is it freemium? Do you let them try out and then you charge them the money? Will they get angry? So those are the things that we are going to try out. We don't know how it will turn out, but we'll see.
It's only free because we pay with our data, right? We pay with our information. So in a way, being able to make people more aware that, well, either you as an organization, we move on to doing like everything else, selling the data, or we expose that to the public as an encouragement as well to participate financially.
Yeah, that's such a good
Really
point you brought up,
exciting.
Suki. Yeah, because I mean, it's if it's an offline collective experience, you expect to pay for it because work was done to enable this event, and there are people on site that show you these are the people involved. But like for the online experience, it just doesn't seem that there are people involved or that there's work involved behind the scenes, because it's sort of like poof, you appear, and oh poof, you disappear. Kind of thing. So it's interesting then that in that sense, it is in itself ephemeral as well, because it just sort of like, I mean, after we finish this talk, we just sort of switch off our laptops and then get on with life, I guess. And it's really strange. I kind of find that moment, or like the traveling to and traveling from something, I miss that. Like the anticipation, and then also like the kind of coming down from the experience and thinking about it. There isn't that physical space for you to experience that. What do you guys think about that personally and in relation to your projects?
I am just going to say I miss it so much, because I think what was interesting about the anticipation, and for me personally, I miss the walking away from an experience, because I always visit these things with friends, and it is only after I leave the space and I have conversations with them about what we just saw or we experienced that I kind of have the chance to process it and figure out like what I really enjoyed, what spoke to me, and like what maybe, because also we're in the arts community, we talk about it from a more like kind of critical point of view as well. So that was what would kind of indicate to me that this experience is over. Whereas now when you watch something online and it ends and like there's no chat group in which you guys are discussing it, there's nothing happening on the side, it's a bit like, oh, it happened. So I think that kind of process of having conversations is fascinating, and it's actually something that also made an O experience pretty unique, because that was built into most experiences that we created. So now we're trying to find out how to bring it back. Like, who can you have a conversation with if you are online as part of our experience? Who can you speak to? So I think that, yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that Netflix had this like party interface where you can chat with your friends as you're watching a film or something.
Yes.
I thought, but you're so right that the sharing of the experience is just as important as what you're going through. And we see so many good things now when we're sharing them with ourselves after.
Yeah. And I think Netflix did it like as best as it could, because that's basically how I got through the entire circuit breaker, is having Netflix parties with various people. But it's so sad, right? Because then the minute you switch your attention from the screen to like that thing, you miss something as well. And that disconnect to me is a lot more real online than it ever is in physical spaces. So you're always compromising for something, which I find the challenge, I guess. Yeah.
And I think to add to that, when you go out in the real world right now, it's so tense, and it's so out of it's only rules and only like caution. And I feel that we're so ready to have other types of experiences that bring more joy and bring more connections between people. That it's not just a space for rule, but a space for care.
Definitely. Well, that brings me to one of the events that Kirti and Supe, you had before things came crashing down, I guess. So in a harbinger of things to come, you had Ayo, Art in Your Own Home, which I think is such a brilliant title, by the way. Brilliant acronym. It took place from 19th to 24th November 2019 with the question, what is being well? And there were 3 pairs of artists and hosts. They came to discuss being well, taking the conversation beyond contemporary wellness and lifestyle trends to everyday rituals and activities that they carried out in pursuit of wellness. Could you talk more about this, especially if there are lessons learned there that are applicable to our current states and moods? I think we'd all love to know.
Yeah, we didn't know how timely that was going to be when we started planning it. I also wanted to say that Supe was literally one of the people hosting these experiences in her house. And I find it really funny because she was talking about her relationship with food as part of this. And then that was one of the major things that changed for Singaporeans, right? Is that when circuit breaker hit, actually, people can't go out to eat, which is the lifeblood of Singaporeans, right? And it's that something as simple as your daily ritual of getting food, getting a nice meal outside has become essentially so reduced. And so I think I actually wanted to also ask Supe, like, how did she feel having essentially prepped for this moment through her art experience? Because we talked about food, we talked about health and like sort of sports and fitness, and we talked about the home, all 3 of which became like a massive kind of big deal in the next few months with circuit breaker. So yeah, it's okay.
I guess if you talk about collective experience, right? Eating is a collective experience, right? So this being taken away from you was not predicted back then. I guess it was timely, so timely that it was scary, because being a modern Singaporean, like working, married, working, both working, you don't have time to cook. You just keep packing food from outside, or you just visit your in-laws' place and get home cooked food from there. So when this whole thing happened, your collective experience with all these people is just gone, and then you're isolated in your home, and cooking and paying attention to how you cook, how you eat became actually more prominent. And of course, all these topics that we talked about during IO, about mental, as well as mental health and everything, got really, really important, and you start reflecting on this because you have time. But actually, it's also a time where you get to reflect, I guess. So there's this thing that my husband and I started doing, which is every day we checked in with 3 friends and talked to them, I think, and asked them how they are. So I think that in itself is also a collective experience at the end of the day. I think when we talk about collective experience, it's also how can you make the best out of it during such time to think about others and still connect with others. It can never, of course, the whole physical thing that we talked about previously, about how you get to get out of the experience and then talk about it. Those, I think, can never ever be replaced by the digital. But I think there are ways that we can all think about how can we still have that experience. But I haven't tried, actually. There's one thing that popped into mind, actually, to eat together with all your friends, but they're all screens. That'll be quite fun. Maybe we can make it in the artwork.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think eating is just like one thing you can look forward to. But then at some point it also became quite tedious because then it was all you look forward to and it felt really primal and basic. But also people started getting really competitive ordering food, and then there were all these like timed releases. Like you had to be online at a certain time, and people went nuts. They really were there at that moment, and then things sold out in like 5 minutes. I don't know whether this is like a uniquely Singapore experience, because Mouna, I see you looking at us like, what?
It was for bubble tea. It was all bubble tea. It was released at 11
There was no bubble tea for a while.
on at
I forgot about that.
11:01. Yeah.
I blocked that out because I was traumatized. Okay, now that you remind me.
It was a weird time.
Yeah, it's very really Singaporean, I think. But I wanted to just go back to the Daily tous les jours project, the Better Together Reflections for Pandemic Times, because I see a question came in from John Maxgo, who talked about how there are these interesting insights you shared on urban design, of course. But yeah, I mean, I think definitely it's challenging to do this in pre-built environments, especially now that you have to navigate social distancing measures. But I think I want to go a bit beyond the question and ask, how do you envision that these things you talked about how the urban setting should be social, equitable, walkable, distributed, renaturalized, sustainable, and resilient. How do you envision that these will be best realized in a post-pandemic world? What is your vision for that?
I think one thing that became really clear is that whenever we go back, we need to do it better. And the whole UN vision of Build Back Better was really inspiring. So I think beyond like the physical and the digital, I think it's about balance. It's about rebalancing. Maybe we were a little bit extreme on many fronts of our lives. Maybe we had lost a sense of touch with very basic elements, whether they be awareness to communities we couldn't see, or awareness to consumption, or how we operate as a society. I think this is it's about rebalancing and making it better than it was. Like if you are to build it again, do it like it should be, with what we've learned.
Wake-up call is a recalibration on a personal level and as a collective. So I think I'm just gonna, I think I'm gonna go to my last question for the night. This will be a really broad and kind of like thinking about the future, future-proofing, if you will. How do you think art, design, culture can separately or together facilitate our hopes and dreams for a better tomorrow? And how do you plan to realize this with Daily tous les jours and Open House?
Small
It's
question.
a very broad question, yeah. But I guess maybe you can talk about it in terms of what your plans are, or how like your long-term ideal visions for your your individual collectives are going to achieve. How is that going to help realize or facilitate our hopes and dreams for a more balanced tomorrow, I guess?
I think definitely the time to do that reflection has been an opportunity also to reconsider a lot of our own work and the limited time that we have to do it, and to kind of try to realign our personal values, our studio's values, our art practice, and the communities that we engage with together around things that matter. And so I guess our hope and our dream is that we can continue creating opportunities for people to connect and inspire them to take active roles in the world that we live in, and really engage with the huge challenges that we're facing now, of course, with the pandemic today, but that pandemic being, unfortunately, probably just a taster for many different challenges that we're going to face collectively in the upcoming decades. And so You talked about recalibration, which I think is interesting. There's also probably an alignment that we want to work on. So making sure that, yes, we can design and bring joy and contribute to resiliency, and doing it in a way that is coherent with the world that we want to build.
Thank you for that. Really well said. What about for you, Kirti and Supay? I mean, you did something very relevant actually for the pandemic with IO. So how do you see, art, design, and culture? Because you do all of these things in your experiences. How do you see yourselves pushing this agenda forward in your vision for a better tomorrow as well?
I think for open house, one of the key things that we always want to do when we tell all these stories, when we bring people into neighborhoods, is to build that connection. Because Singapore, I mean, we are so well known for rapid changes, right? Like you can walk down the street and suddenly there's this building and you never realized that it was there. It's that kind of scary, and you can have your like childhood place or even teenagehood place like just torn down like the next moment. And so when we want to bring people to such spaces and tell all these stories is to build a connection. I think this pandemic, just now we talked about how public spaces it is actually quite heightened in the sense that people pay more attention to it. And with that, I think it is to our advantage, because by paying more attention to it, perhaps you care a bit more about it. And when we do shows or we tell stories of that space, you feel more connected to it. And probably you will even have added a moment now that, oh, I remember when I was circuit breaker, I actually tried to hang out here in this void deck instead of looking at what we call the void deck, which is the ground floor of the apartment, as just a space where it holds either funeral or weddings, and you just use it and walk past. You don't even like gather and talk to people there anymore. But when we come in, perhaps next time when we can do physical things, there can be more collective memory, contributing to all these stories being built up as a whole, and you can take creative ownership over there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think in this panel discussion, we have discussed a myriad of things, and, thinking about like the blurring of the public and private space, how an awareness of the public space has been heightened, as well as of the private space as well, because we have to navigate the two in different ways than before. And I have learned so much about, the power of collaboration and community as a way forward, and how, together we are definitely better, and that art, design, and culture are ways that we use to cope with the challenges that we face, are ways that we use to support each other to get through difficult times. So I'm wondering if any of you has any last comments to make before I wrap up the panel discussion. If not, thank you so much for the conversation and the camaraderie. I think, Melissa, you had something to say?
Maybe just a follow up with what Mouna was saying about how, what's ahead of us. What's really ahead of us is more of this, and maybe not to forget that as everything around us is sometimes sad, difficult, and feels like just a set of rules and regulations, I think we need to bring back joy, and joy is just as important as it's the key thing to build trust between us. And that without trust, we don't have much of a community, we don't have much of a democracy. And so if there's one word maybe to take away today, is joy.
So well said. And on that note, we'll take this with us as we move forward. Thank you very much for that, Melissa, and thank you to everyone on the panel, Mouna, Kirti, and Supay as well, for the conversation, for the camaraderie. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that you at home have also enjoyed this with us, and please join us for the rest of CIFA version 2.0. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Nadya.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, Supay and Kirti.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.